Well, good morning and welcome to this early morning edition of the Draft Professor 800, joined today by Owen. Owen, it is really good to see you after a 4-day holiday weekend. It was a 4-day weekend for me because I didn't podcast on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or Monday. Um, but we are back. How are you this morning?
Good and good for you, Jimmy. Finally taking a bit of the grind off.
Yeah. I think a grind is a good way to describe it. But we are back. We are diving deep into the 2027 and 2028 draft classes. This show is specifically on the Big Ten safeties. And just so the audience knows, and Owen and I were talking about this backstage a little bit, there's usually two lists that are given for every podcast. So the first list is here's the safeties that we kind of know about. And then the second list is, well, here's the starting safeties in the Big Ten, but literally they're not like nobody's podcasted on them. We haven't heard about them, um, kind of thing. So we're going to be hearing about players from both lists today. But Owen, who is the first Big Ten safety that you think everybody should have on their draft radar?
Well, it's somebody who I think was previously already on a draft radar, which is Terry Moore, previous of Duke, now at Ohio State. I think that was the number one name I was looking at when given this list. He was a big time player for Duke. I believe he got hurt last year, and if he didn't, he probably would have came out in this past year's draft class. Um, So he's transferred to Ohio State. He's looking to replace Caleb Downs, which is going to be some big shoes to fill. But for me, I think he's a player that fits that role that they ran with Downs last year really well. He does operate a lot from the single high, but isn't afraid to fly down and fill gaps and attack with the run and be aggressive on blitzing and defending the run, especially in the outside zones. He has some good length and some good size, and then he's able to really attack the ball while it's in the air. So for me, he's a player that probably could have been a drafted player, maybe even a day two drafted safety who just didn't have an opportunity to capitalize on how much of his talent is by going out in the draft this year. So now he's transferred to Ohio State, getting the best possible look for a team that just had a safety
Nice. So that's Terry Moore, Duke transfer to Ohio State.
drafted.
And then, oh, and where does the discussion go next for safeties in the Big Ten? Yep. And Owen may still have another browser open that's got a pop up.
No. Now we're just dealing with regular goal technical issues. I guess I'm running out of excuses for Spectrum here at this point. uh,
Okay, so who's the next safety up?
um, guy who I found the most fun to watch at this point, and it was Rory Fitzgerald from Northwestern.
Nice.
He's a fun name to watch. Uh,
Yeah, we're working through some audio issues here. We'll see if Owen has a minute. We had some of these issues backstage before we went live. And okay, so Owen will be back here momentarily. We had some issues prior to going live, but Owen was just talking about Terry Moore, the Duke transfer to Ohio State, and then the next safety up for him was Robert Fitzgerald, who is a safety at Northwestern. Um, and then a couple of other safeties that we're probably going to hear about. Jeremiah Cooper from Penn State, Coy Parrish from Oregon, Kerry Brown, safety from Minnesota, Rod Moore, safety from Michigan. I think this is the third or fourth draft cycle we've talked about Rod Moore. Amari Farrell, safety from Indiana, Matthew Bailey, safety from Illinois. And there were some people that were talking about Matthew Bailey last year. Okay.
Am I back?
We
No.
Yes, I can hear you.
Awesome. Okay, yeah. So I switched you over to my phone real quick just because that would be probably better when it comes to connectivity. So we'll try that out for now.
Okay. So
S-
you were just talking about Robert
So
Fitzgerald, the safety from Northwestern.
yes, he was probably my most fun watch. There's always one of these players in this list that you give me that I don't expect to be the player I'm gonna love watching the most. And this was Fitzgerald this week. He was one of those players. New Weston on Twitter has been putting up these graphs. He's doing a lot of data work, and two of the graphs he puts up were safeties that were run defense versus pass coverage versus a versatile piece, and then safeties that were good at the catch point and good coverage safeties versus ones that were more developmental. And Fitzgerald was definitely on like the kind of the middle towards the middle of the quadrants when it came to catch point and coverage traits specifically. So he wasn't in the full developmental corner where there was a lot of large cluster. He was kind of able to hold his own. But he was by far and away one of the best when it came to run defense and tackle rate percentage and things like that. And when you watch the tape, it kind of matches the stats. The film matches the analytical data where he is a guy that is shot out of a cannon coming downhill, especially from the third and even the second level. He's built like a linebacker, like 6'1" to 6'2", anywhere up to 220 pounds, the announcers would call him during his regular season games when I did watch Northwestern. And he's a player that just like closes the gap, is a sure-handed tackler, is very explosive. He showed it against top level competition. He played in Northwestern last year. He was a starter for them last year, where against Oregon, against other teams where you'd expect maybe a player would show some of that lack of athleticism if he was just exclusively a run defending kind of box safety. He showed up, was rangy from side to sideline, making big time tackles. He's just one of those players that if you really value high level, I caution to say elite run defense. This is a player that maybe you'd be looking for your strong safety, or in the age of the new defenses where you need these 220 plus pound defenders to play the nickel hybrid linebacker type players. We just saw Kyle Lewis go relatively high because of that. This is a player in Fitzgerald that I think could maybe adapt and develop into that style of player right now. So for me, he's a player I'm very interested to see how his next season progresses and if he can add some more interception or pass defense statistics to go along with some of the film. I think he could definitely be a player that I would covet and be one of my guys early on in this class.
See, and this is actually one of my favorite parts of this process too, right? Because you are by far the first person I have heard mention Robert Fitzgerald, safety from Northwestern. So, like, already, Deshaun Stribling 2.0, we'll find out soon.
Yeah, I mean, it all comes down to what you value. I think it definitely helps out with because he was on our list, but he was in our like our secondary list. And again, Newt's been doing some phenomenal work over on Twitter, posting these graphs. He just did ones where he did like three or four of them based on quarterbacks on different statistics and foiling them against each other and seeing who is kind of standing out as these like statistical outliers when it comes to different percentages and different rates of tackling and things like that for the safety specifically in addition to the coverage numbers to find guys who are statistically above the rest. And that's where like Fitzgerald kind of popped for me. I was looking just through that list of guys. Some of these guys, the background information kind of bleeds together where it's like they're consistent starters, but they don't get awards or anything. I think Fitzgerald did get an honorable Big Ten mention. But some of these guys that aren't like all Americans, these all season kind of all Big Ten type players, you're like, okay, well, are these guys really even worth the deep dive into? And then I watched or I went and looked at Newt's stats, and that was the guy who first like popped, like, okay, there's a guy totally outside this cluster in the good way. Let me go check him out. And that was the positive experience I got from doing that. So definitely give him a follow. And that's if you combine your previous knowledge of the teams plus the stats, it definitely helps out and opens up your eyes to who to watch in this kind of muddy time of the season of who of how people are going to fit and what teams are going to be actually having draft eligible players.
Okay, so that was Robert Fitzgerald from Northwestern. Owen, where does the safety discussion go next?
Well, I know we have a theme here of mentioning our favorite teams on here, but I'll start with John's favorite team in Oregon, where Coy Parrish is a player that I would definitely say keep him on your radar. Another team where you had a highly drafted safety uh, in Dylan Thieneman coming out of there, he went in the first round this year, and they run a very unique system. So I was curious to see how they were going to replace him, and they went with a transfer similar to the situation with Terry Moore in Ohio State, where you have a player that is kind of established on another team already. Terry Moore coming from Duke, Corey Parrish coming from Minnesota. Now he was less of a less of a full time starter at Minnesota when it comes to the safety position. He definitely rotated in, and that's kind of the good thing about safeties is even if you're not a starter, you're getting a significant amount of snap time on defense. He also was their kick and punt returner, so you can see the level of athleticism they were going for there. He was getting opportunities to play with the ball in his hands and be on the field in general, even though he wasn't their starting safety at Minnesota. So I do think that he will come in and have an opportunity to be that kind of immediate replacement. And like I said, Oregon runs this very funky defense, and where Thieneman kind of found his home was it was a middle of the field safety, but instead of it being your traditional single high overlooking the entire back end of the defense, kind of ranging from sideline to sideline, it was this hybrid of cover three and cover four, where instead of having the middle high safety be the deepest man in the middle, he was kind of the deeper overhang where he would sit at the same level as both corners, but you started out with both corners starting at deeper depth than him, and he would kind of sink down a little bit shallower as the corners fully extended out into their deeper coverage drops. So you have a unique system in defense where you're going to need a player who has some good athleticism to be ranging in the middle there, which I think Parrish does have, but also someone who can kind of adapt to that and play something they're not normally used to playing. So I'm interested to see that. The NMM transferred from Purdue, picked it up really quickly. I think that's why he got so many high accolades, but we'll see if another player can come in and be the first to step into that system there, and take over. Which that's another factor when you talk about these summer scouting reports is the transfers versus who is a returning starter for these teams, because you have returning starters, especially if the coaching staff stays consistent. And now you're ending up having a system where the team and the scheme is still familiar with the player. You have them in your building the entire offseason. And as soon as the season ends, they're putting in work. They're working on the playbook. They're working on their bodies. You are in tap with that guy the entire time. Versus a transfer, you're bringing them in, whether it's in the winter or the spring transfer window, and that becomes a player that you're not as familiar with, or you have to get up to speed with some of the guys that are already there mentally or physically for what you're looking for that position. So a lot of times you'll see players who were non-transfers get the favor over transfer players at this point in the season. Now Terry Moore and Quay Parrish are ones that I think are a little bit different, but you talk about that with Fitzgerald and another player I'll talk about in a second because I got to talk about my Washington guys. Players who are there for a second consecutive season, and that becomes a theme, a reason why you would think they can kind of take the next step based on what they showed last year.
Okay, so we've got 3 safeties that we've talked about. Do you have another Big Ten safety that should be entering the draft discussion?
Yes, so I have two more really that I'm big fans of, and one is obvious because he plays for my team, and I'm going to be a big fan of him regardless. I think I'm a less of a big fan of him, so I'll start with him right now. And that's Alex McLaughlin from Washington, transfer from Northern Arizona last year, and was a starter immediately, and was given you Washington's Defensive MVP award for the entirety of last season over the likes of Takario Davis, over Ephesians Price Sox drafted players and especially in the secondary as well. We also covered their linebackers last week. They had players that ended up going in this draft class and who are going to be guys we're looking at going forward. But I do think he was the best when it comes to any of the returning players that I'm the most excited about specifically. Um, the corners are gone now, so he's gonna have to really take that over. But he's a guy 6'2", north of 205, and he's kind of this lower hang, box safety. Washington's defense again is kind of unique, where it's a lot of cover three, a lot of cover six, where the corners were asked, even like when there was like heavy rotation to where they had strength on one side of the field. You would see a lot of times Takario Davis would come back and be the single high free safety because there was no receiver on his side of the field, and he would rotate up as the free safety would rotate down and give more support on the run to where they were running heavier personnel. So McLaughlin would be an occasion at the single high, but for the most part, he was on that second, maybe like 2.5 level, where he's kind of floating between being a safety and a linebacker. But he has the size and the run acumen to do that. He plays really well in space when it comes to breaking down and making tackles. He's long and rangy with his tackling form because he has so much length in his arms and he is so tall. He does really well when it comes to those short area coverage. I definitely the zone, especially in the hook curl, being able to read the quarterback's eyes and undercut throwing lanes, especially with using his length to take away leverage that most defenders don't really have. He has movement and the length, so that really helps him out. He had some good production. He had two interceptions against Washington State in the Apple Cup, including a pick six. He had a fumble recovery for a touchdown against UCLA. He's a very much a big play player, had good production, and has that size and that run defensive. Like, kind of give him a floor for what you're looking at as safety. He's a little bit lean. I'd like to see him add a few more pounds on, but I don't want him to sacrifice any of the athleticism he does actually have in his frame. Do that. So I'm curious to see if he gets more of a traditional safety look, or he's going to reprise his role as kind of that robber safety in a cover three kind of more man coverage heavy defense, and we'll see if that's where he goes. When he did get put in man coverage a bit, he struggled in some reps and excelled in others. I do think he definitely had some sticky coverage, but couldn't really finish on plays when it came to playing the ball in the air. So he's got some development to do. I don't think he's one of these top guys you're going to be getting out of the safety room, but he's a player that I'm a big fan of, obviously, but I do think has the size, athleticism, production, and accolades at this point on a defense that had proven talent to have some kind of upside to be a draft eligible player this year after his first season of moving up from a lower level of competition.
That's Alex McLaughlin, safety from Washington.
Yes.
And where do we go next?
So we'll stick with the 2023 national championship teams because this is a player that I've been super high on, or at least for two draft cycles now, because or at least since last summer scouting, which was me watching the tape from 2 years ago, watching tape from this year, and now we're moving into another year of tape with Rod Moore from Michigan. Um, this
I
is gonna
knew
be
where you were going. As soon as you said we've talked about him before, I'm like, I think I know who this is.
yeah, third time in a row talking about Rod Moore for a draft. Um, We'll see if he actually sticks this time. I know injuries have been a big issue because he had like a really devastating knee injury um, after his really good, strong 2023 campaign. So he missed the majority of 2 seasons ago. And then last season he played, but it was kind of a slower build up process because he was still recovering from a major knee injury. So a lot of what you hope to get, you started seeing a bit more. I know I definitely kept tabs on him through the season because he hadn't yet not declared because he had an injury red shirt. So I was keeping tabs on him, seeing how my guy Rob Moore was doing. And I think he still was playing at a relatively high level. I don't think he was at the level that I originally thought he was at. You could definitely tell he was playing a bit slower and a bit more cautious on that knee to the point where before I would say I would describe him as center field, really explosive safety who can come downhill and attack when blitzing or when defending the run, filling gaps, using that speed as a weapon, being basically a cruise missile out there. And you got a little bit of that, especially on like wide receiver screens and some plays where it was easy to click and diagnose where he was going, and the aggressiveness was still there mentality wise. I just think that he was definitely favoring that knee a bit more. But if you're looking for a player that, when back to being fully healthy, if he ever is back to 100%, he is flying around with his hair on fire, has made big plays in the past. I know this is going to sound like ancient history, but he was utilized a lot when it came to in a lot of different spaces. He wasn't just a free safety, but back when he was a true freshman for Michigan, he was a player they used a lot in man coverage. There were plays of him against Michigan State Keon Coleman where he was locking him up in man coverage in the entire game, which was probably it was super impressive to me because you're thinking Keon Coleman now. He's been in the league. This is gonna be his third season in the league, and this is talking about a season prior to him transferring to Florida State before he got drafted. But at that point, he was this kind of hybrid college basketball NFL or college football player who ends up getting drafted first pick in the second round to the NFL. And you have a true freshman kid going one on one with him a lot of the game and competing for jump balls and winning those battles against Michigan State. And you'd think like at the time that this is a Michigan State player against Michigan, it's not really the highest level competition, but that was like the Michigan State team that was actually kind of good. And obviously Keon developed into who he was. So early on, Rod Moore was thrown into the fire and kind of given opportunities to show himself. And I think his trajectory was at that point level of being like a second round pick. I had a second round grade on him after watching that summer scouting process, banking on him coming back and returning back from injury strong. And then it didn't come all together this year. I think he still dealt with being banged up a bit this season. His production didn't really follow up. But I do think if you can get back to him being the super aggressive flying missile around there, I think maybe you might want to put him more as a split safety now if you're not trusting that his safety speed at single high will come back. But for me, he's a player that has the intangibles, has the starting experience. has the athleticism and has all the right tools. You just got to see if he puts it all together again and recaptures what he had previously, which was somebody that I was really excited to see played out once they got to the level that they're at.
And again, Rod Moore, like you said, from Michigan, third year that we've covered him on the channel. This might even be the fourth. So best of success to Rod Moore. Hopefully, this is his year. Um, where do we take the Big Ten safety draft discussion next?
Now I know when I was cutting in and out and dealing with the phenomenal the Wi-Fi situation I had earlier. I heard you mention one of the players, and I wanted to make sure I didn't step over there. Who are you bringing up there
Oh,
specifically?
I went through some of the players like Matthew Bailey, Amari Farrell, Kerry Brown as basically a tease for some names that you're probably going to be talking about when you come back.
Gotcha. Yeah. Um, Here's a player that we also talked about last year. I can't remember if we did a preseason watch through of Florida State or if we just we're talking on him early on because we thought maybe he can come out. But Earl Little Jr. from Florida State is another transfer player. He's now at Ohio State, so we got another transfer at Ohio State. We went with Terry Moore initially. Now it's Earl Little Jr. They also have a player in when I was talking about those kind of graphs that Newt has with the safeties. There was another player from Ohio State who actually graded pretty well out on their run defense. I'll just throw his name out there because I don't know if he's going to be a starter for them this year with the fact they have all these transfers coming in. But Jalen McCain or Jalen McClain. We'll see how they balance that out. Maybe one of these players will be a nickel, and one of these players will be the other two will be actual true safety starters. But McClain doesn't have a ton of reps, but in the reps he did play in the limited action he saw, he performed pretty well, especially against the run, particularly. But back to Earl Little, he was a player that I watched at Florida State and was conflicted about. He was one of those guys where he had length, he had speed, he had range, um, but he was super aggressive. You liked a lot when it worked out and he rolled the dice and he gambled. It looked amazing, highlight level plays, and was able to kind of make good breaks on the ball, make some big hits. But definitely when you were watching the All 22, you could see how undisciplined he was when it came to sticking in his zones and being more comfortable on the back end with staying home and waiting for routes to develop into his area as opposed to chasing them. So he definitely got beat deep, and Florida State was kind of a mess this past season in general anyway. Um, so he transfers out. I do think he's a player that if you get him in the right coaching system where they can kind of get their hands on him and mold him, you have traits, you have talent that's clearly obvious on the film, and you do like to have your guys have a bit of that aggressive mindset because you don't want to have to pull that out of them. You'd rather have them have that and then mold that into a more usable method. So for me, Earl Little is a player that while he isn't my favorite when it comes to the film he put on in the past. And I do think staying and going another year, and even transferring to Ohio State is a really strong move for his career. I do think that he is going to be a player that can up like I'm not the biggest fan of him, but I do think that he's taking the steps to make me a fan just from what he's been doing to lead up to this season and hopefully being a 2027 NFL draft hopeful there. So I don't know if you remember anything else about Earl Little, Jim, but that was one of our I can't remember where we first watched him. I
Yep.
remember watching him though
Well,
last year.
we did a mid-season safety show. We did like two or three with Yumi and Jake, and he was definitely on that list. Right. So it was before we did scouting reports, but we didn't necessarily do like a preseason safety show. So I was like, "Hey, can you guys go look at these safeties?" So I think you and Jake ended up doing that prior to when Newt came back. But we definitely covered him. So Earl Little was definitely covered, and not just by you, right? Because the next safety group was Stephen Shaw, also covered Earl Little, and he may have even been covered on the corner show too.
I
Because
can see him playing. That's actually pretty interesting. I was talking about how between Fitzgerald transfer or not Fitzgerald, that's Northwestern. Between the transfer of Terry Moore, now you have Earl Little, and then you have a guy who was already there, McClain, that was established. One of those players, I think all three are going to see the field. McClain is a junior, a true junior, so he might get less of the true safety looks, but he was also there from last season. He's in non-transfers. Like I said, that usually gives them an upward advantage to be able to get there. But also, you'd think they had two transfer safeties coming in. how good does that really reflect on McLean? So there's kind of a dichotomy there, especially when you have multiple transfers. But I think all three players will definitely have to get on the field at some point. And I do think that they run a decent amount of nickel when it comes to that because they definitely had multiple linebackers that could have been out there, but they were very versatile in their looks. So I do think that all three of those guys will touch the field. It's going to be for me who stands out the most. I'm sure it's going to be Terry Moore, but I can definitely see Orlando being that guy who we're like, okay, he's going to be the slot corner type player because of the athleticism, because of some of the length he has. Um, he's a bit on the leaner side too, so I definitely could see that as being like the player that they want to move in more of a nickel, straight up corner, or slot corner type mold as opposed to Moore or McLean. So I didn't even know you guys covered him at corner. That's actually pretty interesting for me.
Well, and it may have been, he's listed as a corner. Was he playing slot at Florida State? But he was on multiple lists that were evaluated last draft cycle. So that was Earl Little, safety at Ohio State, transfer from Florida State, with a brief mention of Jalen McLean, the other safety from Ohio State. And then, Owen, where's the conversation go next?
So we're gonna touch on a guy who has significant amounts of starting experience. I don't know how much of a fan I am of his as a overall like athlete per se, but you see this guy, you see his accolades, you're like, okay, you got to give him a shot at least, and that's gonna be Matthew Bailey from Illinois. He was a true freshman starter for them back in 2022. So he's a player that I think would have been if you can kind of continue through the normal pathway, he would have been out of eligibility by this past year's draft class. However, he missed the majority of the 2023 season. So he was started 2022 for the second he stepped onto Illinois' football field, missed 2023 with an injury, and then 2024, 2025 back-to-back full starter years, with 2025 being his best when it comes to recording statistics. Had a ton of tackles, led a team in tackles, had a ton of tackles for loss, and he was a player that was kind of all over the field. Bigger box safety, 6'2", 225, and that similar mold of bigger guys that are going to be playing more towards the line of scrimmage, filling holes, filling gaps, being a presence in the run defending game. But the question becomes, are they going to be able to move and cover in space as well? Or are these going to be is this going to be your true new style of hybrid defender, like how I feel like Robert Fitzgerald can be? Or is it going to be this similar tweener that doesn't have a true home in the NFL style player like some other guys that we've seen in previous years that didn't end up getting drafted because they're too slow to play safety, not big enough to be a linebacker. And the slot corner position, they're not good enough in man coverage to really handle that. So for me, Bailey is a player that I want to see more of when it comes to that kind of space coverage. Maybe shed 5 pounds off of his frame because he is a bit bulkier. To see if he can move a bit better because I do think if you're going to go with that transition and try to fit into that new mold of defense or that new mold of defensive archetype that teams are really valuing right now, you want to be closer to 220, 215, have that lighter weight on you so you can move more in space and be, at the worst, a coverage player, but offer that upside of being more physical, either in man coverage against tight ends or in the run game. I think you'd rather lean coverage first, then add on the weight and be a run defender versus the other way around because in the NFL, everything gets faster. And if you're already seen as kind of more slow and stiff, like I think I would call Bailey at this moment, I don't think that the NFL would be very great for him. So I'd like to see what his body transformation is this year. He has the accolades, he has the leadership, he has all the starting experience you'd want in the world, and that's usually a highly coveted thing by NFL teams. It's going to be more so: can he check off these athletic boxes? Can he improve his coverage production for this upcoming season? On a team in Illinois that has produced safeties in the past. So I trust the coaching. The fact that he's been a starter since he walked on there as a high schooler at 18 and then continued to be one when he wasn't hurt makes me very optimistic for him mentally and be able to run a defense that can translate to the NFL. It's just going to be more so again the athletic testing. Can he transform his body a bit more? Is he fully recovered from the injury? A lot of these questions that are only going to be solved by watching him play this upcoming season, but there's a lot of likable traits with him, especially with the intangibles.
Yeah, and, Taylor, one of the other draft professors, he will not quit Matthew Bailey. So, he gives a very similar assessment to you, but like you said, if this is a 3-year starter in the Big Ten, right? Starting as a true freshman, this will be his 4th year as a starter. Um, Taylor loves Matthew Bailey, and that's great that you liked him enough to mention him as well. And then, Owen, where do you wanna take the safety discussion next?
So I mean, there's a couple guys left that like you can mention names like Amari Farrell from Indiana is going to be a player that's going to continue to start for them. Had a good season last year. In that entire team kind of had a magical run. So I'm curious to see if he can put it together because I wasn't like the biggest fan of his tape in general. Like I felt like there was definitely some holes in there, but he played well enough, and obviously they put together a good enough season that he was impactful for winning national championship game. But I just need to see more consistent starting out of him, and he got not the most meaningful reps because there was a lot of underneath coverage when it came to Indiana's defense. You saw a lot of players who were running kind of lower zones, and he'd be kind of way far off in the back, just being on the prevent there. I would like to see him kind of contribute a bit more. He is on the younger side, so he's a player that we'll be looking forward to for the future moving forward because I do think he is only um, or maybe he is a senior. I thought with his age, he'd been a bit younger on the timeline, but I do think he is a full senior. So let's see if we can put it all together there. I don't know. Is there any major glaring names that I've missed mentioning here, Jim? For because I feel like the ones that I've been the most passionate about talking about and discussing for this show, we've kind of already hit, especially like the kind of under the radar names with Fitzgerald specifically.
So I've got 4 names that you haven't mentioned yet. Have you looked at Kerry Brown from Minnesota?
Yes. So Kerry Brown, he's fun. I'm curious with the Minnesota because they always are hot and cold with how good they are every year. Because like we've had Anthony Smith from last year with the D line, and you have this guy who has big measurables, be able to fit in and look the part, and then you like okay, Minnesota as a team or as a defense wasn't that great. Kerry Brown, I wouldn't call him like this measurable monster, but he's a player that looks good, played really well, started all 13 games for them last year. I like the athletic traits and the ability he showed, especially because he was an all Big Ten honorable mention, academic Big Ten. Like he made impactful plays, and as a freshman, he was in all 12 of their games. He played well as a young player from Minnesota. He's if not this season. I do think that because he went from freshman participating in all games, playing well, being all freshman for a couple weeks there, and then becoming a starter in sophomore year. I do think he could potentially make that next step. I would probably think it's going to be 2 drafts from now, is where I'd see him the most comfortable for myself. Just because unless he makes a giant leap in development for this specific season, I don't see him coming out as a true junior and making that kind of level, especially with the safeties we talked about just in the Big Ten today. I wouldn't put him over a couple of these guys, but he has the upside. I could definitely see him being another one of those guys like Coy, who was his teammate last season, that makes that transfer after this year, leaving Minnesota to go to a higher end team, maybe another Ohio State transfer, or Oregon transfer. That's where Coy went. But he's a player that has taken developmental steps that I'm very interested in. But for me, I think it's going to be play this season, be another year of starting experience. Then for your final senior season, make that transfer to a higher level school, or stick it with Minnesota, I guess, if you wanted to. But I think he needs to go through his full 4 years and put together the most consistent tape he can. Because at this point, it's good but inconsistent for me.
And Sam Teets was mentioning Kerry Brown during summer scouting last summer. So always like to have referrals from Sam as well as guys that he has his eye on. Another safety that seems to be getting a lot of attention is Tao Johnson from UCLA.
Oh, he's the transfer. I mean, I guess I say that because it's UCLA. I should have just expected to be a transfer. Like half their team this season, because I think they had major coaching change turnover. All of them are transfer. He's the transfer from Utah, I believe.
I believe so. Yes. Yes.
Another guy, big body, 6'1", 200. I really like his frame. Like you see these safeties, and a lot of them will put down on their page that they're over 200 pounds. And like Alex McLaughlin is written down as 205. You could tell me he's 6'2", so maybe he's over that, but you could tell me he was 195, and I believe you too. He's a little bit on the leaner side. He plays more strong than that, but like a guy like Johnson looks the part. He looks bulky. I don't know if it's the tattoo sleeve he's got that accents his muscles or something, but he just looks kind of beefed up and looks like he fits that role. He was a consistent player at Utah, which is always kind of a producer of these talented players, especially at safety, and especially the style of safety that kind of comes down. We talked about previously has a high floor where they're able to fit the run, sure-handed tackle with things like that leading into it. I'm curious. I haven't looked it up. I haven't looked it up on the sheet. where Tal Johnson is on Newt's graphs because that usually is. Every time I've looked into stats like that, when it comes to safeties in their run defense, Utah always kind of rates the highest, even with their guys who are more traditional free safeties. They usually often have good angle attacking. I do think Tal Johnson brings that to the table. I'm going to see where UCLA. I'm kind of confused. I don't know what their full on scheme is going to be, so I don't want to assume where Johnson's fit's going to be with them. But I can definitely see as an athlete with production coming from Utah is definitely someone of interest, especially for a UCLA team that's trying to do a full on overhaul with their players there. So I'm interested to see where he ends up landing with that. I'm pulling up his chart here with New right now. On the so this is the defensive or no, this is defensive tackles. Oops, not safeties. Uh, here's so this is coverage versus catch point. The graph here. There's kind of a bigger cluster down towards the developmental corner where you see a lot of guys here, and I'm trying to see if I can find the name for Tal Johnson in this kind of big glot of them. So okay, so here it is. So he had a near 20% forcing completion percentage and near 20 snaps per target. So it kind of a higher volume player when it comes to getting targeted coverage, but still having a higher percentage. So he is kind of separated above the group. So there's a cluster down on the bottom left, and then there's like a next layer, like a bubble on the outside, and that's where he's at. He's not Marcus Ratcliffe from Texas A&M is like all the way off the board. He's like in shut down cover safety corner with 40 targets or snaps per target and like over 30% forcing completion percentage. But like back to there's like a gap, and it's like Robert Fitzgerald and then everybody else, and Tal Johnson's not that far behind in that. So he's a guy that is definitely going to be. I think he's better in coverage. I talked about his run defense a lot. I do think that his coverage is solid. He wasn't utilized in this position where, especially as who are getting less snaps per, going to be more towards the line of scrimmage, getting in throwing windows more often. These guys with more snaps between targets are going to be more traditional free safety types. So when you're talking about a guy who's good at run defense, who's also getting a high volume of targets thrown at them, that's where you start to see these more closer to line of scrimmage type players. Not the single high safety has been a very rare breed. Like we saw last year with last draft class, there's only like 4 or 5 you traditionally call it. I don't think that's what Taylor Johnson's game is. But that's why you would maybe see him kind of closer towards that level of snaps per target in between that. And just to finish the data
Yeah,
spike on here, ooh, we're back.
your audio has been cutting in and out there a little bit.
Oh, okay. Well, just to wrap it up on Teo Johnson, if I'm still here, is at his tackle
Okay.
percentage versus tackles per snap. He had just 0.5 tackles per snap, and then over 20% missed tackle percentage. So I do like him. I think again, I'm not the biggest fan of looking at missed tackle percentages when it comes to players because there's a lot of coaching that requires there, and I think a lot of situations there. But I do think he's a player that I'm interested in seeing.
Okay, and then Penn State is 2 safeties, Jeremiah Cooper and Zion Tracy.
Yeah, Cooper is a player. You know, we talked about Penn State in the O line one, the O line episode, and they are another team that's in a transition with their coaching staff. James Franklin obviously has gone away, and you bring in the head coach from Iowa State. That's where Jeremiah Cooper comes from. He's a player that was transferred in from Iowa State. Was a player there last year. Was a preseason LB12 before the season started. Iowa State had kind of an up and down season, so I can see why he maybe lost some steam, but he was a notable name coming into that year for Iowa State. I remember hearing him. I don't know if we covered him last year in the preseason that time, but like he was on the pre-watch for Jim Thorpe Award, things like that. Like he was a guy that had some hype going into the last draft cycle when he was going to be a third-year starter for Iowa State. And he had some good, he had an up and down season as Iowa State, the team itself did. But he's definitely a player that is more of that more playing in space, kind of gets interceptions, has 8 career interceptions, move more, has covered more ground, be more rangy. I think he's more towards that free safety style than some of the other players we talked about previously, especially when opening up this show. So he's gonna be a guy that if you're looking for a player that plays him more in space, I like him a bit more. He's like 6 foot 184, so he's a bit on the lighter side. He's a little light in the pants, but I definitely think he could grow a bit more into his frame and fill out a bit of that specifically. But I do think you're looking at him for more coming in, taking over as that kind of holdover from Iowa State for this team, and be the starter for them to kind of be more the back end coverage type player for them specifically.
And then did you have anything on Zion Tracy at Penn State as well?
He was one of those guys that, well, because you had Zakee Wheatley come out of Penn State last year, and then between that and the transfers out and the taking over, he was a guy who he had 4 starts last year, participated in more games than that, but he's a player that I didn't see a ton in when it comes to those 4 starts. Safety is one of those positions where you're watching it and they either do everything in a game. They have 10 tackles, they have an interception, they're breaking up balls because the team's trying to push the ball down the field and getting them into the game. Which is why usually you'll see a lot more of the highlights or things like that of the box safeties specifically. You'll find a lot more AJ Halsey highlights than Jalen Husky highlights from last year. I'll tell you that. But players like when there isn't that kind of game plan where they're not close buzzing down to the line of scrimmage and they're not being pushed by deep passes the entire game, safeties can be kind of one of the most boring positions to watch because there's just a lot of reps that go over and over and over again where nothing really happens. So when you have a player who started 4 games, made 16 appearances, but was in a position where in those 4 starts, I didn't see a ton of like pop out plays, like consistent ones, whether it was one offs or not. So he's a guy that I'm more interested in to get more film on specifically, because he was a bit more of that. I do think the thing that was interesting was that he was a punt returner for them. So while he wasn't a starting safety, he did get on the field, similar to we talked about Coy Perch. So I would love to see him get more traditional starts at safety. I'm interested to see if he, as a holdover from the previous Penn State recruiting classes, gets that inside track, or if there's going to be some other guys that can kind of are going to be on equal footing now because they're equal levels of recruited by this new coaching staff, which is by that I mean is none, and see who actually wins out that battle. So if he's a guy that can win out this as to start, I definitely could see him being a guy that takes the next step, especially under the new coaching staff that kind of will give him an opportunity to start.
Okay, so 2 more. Marvin Burks from Wisconsin and Mason Curtis from Michigan.
I didn't get to Curtis from Michigan. I can't remember because I know there was another Michigan safety that I noticed, especially when it was that Rod Moore season where he was hurt, and at points in this season where he was out in and out. I don't know if that was Curtis specifically. That was one of the names I didn't focus on too much. And what was the other one from Wisconsin?
Marvin Burks.
I didn't get I that was the one of the only other ones I had a
Okay.
blind spot on for this. I don't know. Do you have previous mentions of him and want to try to sell me on either of the guys? This is one of my
So
favorite things is when I miss them and then you have to give me the pitch and get me to go watch them as soon as we get off this
so
podcast.
so Marvin Burks, I believe the referral for him came from Dale,
Mhm.
from Bengals and Brews. So other than Dale having mentioned him, nobody else, a draft professor, has mentioned him. Mason Curtis was on Durst's board. So I didn't even he may have not even been on the list until last night, because I was going through Durst's board last night, and Mason Curtis was a name that I didn't have, but that was a name that Durst liked. So, um, and that's, ultimately that's where we are kind of at this point of the summer, is some people have really big boards and other people are building them. So we're all finding players at different times. And there will be a second Big Ten safety show, the 9 p.m. Eastern podcast on Tuesdays. We'll be looking at the list that Owen just generated in about 3 or 4 weeks, kind of
So
thing. So
hold on, so do this is kind of interesting. I did a quick Google for both these guys just to get the background information that I
yep.
missed out on. Mason Curtis 6'5", 211 pounds. That is insanity for a safety. Like 6'5" is ridiculously tall, and he looks it in like the little bit of film I'm getting right here, and then like some pictures. And he was a two-time, or he was a multi-time like player of the week for them last year, even though wasn't a consistent starter. He made like 3 starts, kind of mixed between slot and safety. It looks like he played him more towards an overhang, but he popped against like Northwestern Maryland. I'm interested. Now I'm gonna have to watch this freakazoid. This is like Kyle Hamilton levels of measurables for a Michigan player, which is always interesting, especially for defensive back.
You see,
It,
and it's those little things, right? Because he wasn't high on Durstboard, but he was on Durstboard, and ultimately, like you said, you see a player that's 6'5", 220. You don't usually see safeties that are that tall. So there's probably something. There's a little bit of something there to keep our eye on.
yeah, that's gonna be interesting because that especially with safeties, that becomes a position where your the height can either hurt or harm you, or hurt or benefit you, where you're either way too stiff to play in deep coverage. Or what made Kyle Hamilton so special at that size was that he was still fluid and athletic enough to cover and be rangy, and then that length then becomes a weapon because now you're taking away throwing angles that teams aren't really expecting for you. Extend your tackling range. You can if you can play at that size, you are an elite player. But oftentimes that kind of height will be detrimental for you, and then you become a player that can't really stick at linebacker because you don't have the weight, but you're too tall and too stiff to be a DB in space. So that's always kind of the downside with that. But that would be if he's a player that showed out in limited starts with that size, I definitely think that'd be an interesting watch, especially when you get more consistent starting film for him this year.
And then anything on Marvin Burks from Wisconsin?
From what I'm seeing, he started 12 of 13 games from Missouri last year. He's an SEC transfer into Wisconsin from Missouri, and just kind of was a consistent player for them. Had some production with 49 tackles and a single interception. For me, I think that's you. I don't know. Would you call Wisconsin from Missouri a step down in competition, or would you call that a step up? Because I don't know. I always have this perception of the Jim Leonard Wisconsin defenses, where they were these kind of stud defenses. You go there to get developed into a draft eligible player. But as of recent, I don't know if that would be really considered the award in Wisconsin. I'd have to ask Newt specifically.
Well, so the way I would say is that if you're transferring from Missouri to Wisconsin, there must have been an appeal, whether it was how he was going to be used, or maybe there's an up and coming safety at Missouri we need to keep our eye on.
Yeah, I mean, because that's interesting that he transferred out because they also had Jalen Catalon and they had Torian Pride Jr., who were like all starters for them in the secondary. And now you lose all three of them with the idea maybe he was kind of pushed to transfer out, which would be interesting to see who on their depth or who in the recruiting class was the next guy up kind of thing. So that's interesting. That makes me more interested to see what happens in Missouri than anything with um, Burks at Wisconsin, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and we will be having a SEC safety show, and I will ask some comments on Missouri um, as different people go through. So, to give everybody an idea as to kind of what's going on here, draft professors. So, we have 4 podcasts Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday that focus on one conference. So, SEC Monday, Big Ten Tuesday, ACC on Wednesday, and we'll do the Big 12 on Friday. So, the goal of the Tuesday podcast covering the Big Ten is dive dive deep, dig deep into the Big Ten, make sure we know who all the draft prospects are. And then all those players roll up into the Draft Professor 800. So those are the 800 players, essentially 200 coming from each conference. And that's kind of where we are. So right now, I believe there's like 820 players in the Draft Professor 800. Um, but Owen, do you want to take a moment, introduce yourself, let everybody know about all of the content that you are making?
Yeah, so you can find me here on Tuesday mornings like this, covering the Draft Professor 800 with the Big Ten safeties or Big Ten players in general. For right now, that's most of what I'm doing. I'm also on Twitter at Weekly Huddle and on YouTube at Weekly Huddle, where I'm streaming these most of the time when there isn't technical difficulties, which will be fixed by next week. I guarantee you, Jim. I promise they'll be fixed next week, especially for next week with the running backs. That's gonna be real fun. I'm excited. I'm excited for that. Running backs are always the most fun one, especially when it comes to summer scouting, because it's such a wide swing. But you can catch me here on those mornings, and I'll be around. I know I'm planning another. We did a Family Feud episode pre-draft for some pre-draft opinions, but this time I want to do the Draft Professor post-draft reaction Family Feud. So keep an eye out on that. We'll be planning that and putting that out shortly. So that's all I got really planned at the moment. So unless you can remember anything else that I'm working on, Jim, that I've told you about that I've totally forgotten about at this moment in time. But that's it for me at the moment.
Mm. Well, the other thing, Owen and I are working on starting a Buffalo Bills podcast. You will be getting information on that shortly. But we need a day and time before we give our big announcement. But there's been a little bit going on behind the scenes there. From a draft professor standpoint, like I said, we have podcasts every day on the 2027 and 2028 drafts. So there's a really good chance that I think Owen may have mentioned, I'm going to say 8 players. It's very possible that out of the 8 players, 5 of them are 2027 and 3 of them are 2028. So the players that we cover on these podcasts will actually span 2 drafts, generally speaking. So that's part of how Draft Professor is, let's say, building a player board that will move from one draft to the next. And if you want to see that board on the website, go to the summer scouting pull down. There is a Draft Professor 800 selection, and you'll be able to see the names of every player that we are discussing. They typically get loaded to the website at the end of the week. So, for Owen, myself, and everybody at the Draft Professor, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll have another podcast at 9 p.m. Eastern tonight. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody, and we'll see you on a podcast again soon. Thank you.